Chapter 2, the Constitution and its Origins. Please be sure to have read the Declaration of Independence because it feeds directly into the Constitution, which you're expected to read this week as well. Highly recommend you make a tradition of reading the Constitution once a year. I usually do it on or around July 4th, which ironically is the date pegged for the finalization of the Declaration of Independence, so perhaps I should read both then. But let's talk about the Constitution, but you can't talk about the Constitution without talking about the Declaration of Independence, so it will keep coming up throughout this course. So the Constitution, written in 1787 and amended 27 times since, is what they call a living document that serves as the basis for the U.S. government for more than 200 years. It is an incredible document put together by some incredible people. Was it flawless? No. Was it the best thing going at the time? Yes. Is the U.S. flawless? No. Is it the best thing going at the time? I know I'm biased, but I'd say yes. Now, why should I do the reading? Why should I be watching this lecture? The quiz, homie. You got to be able to do well on the quiz. Here's a hint. John Locke. He was one of the most influential thinkers of the Enlightenment, and his writings form the basis for many modern political ideas, including the U.S. Constitution. So I wonder if I have a quiz question on this. John Locke. So what we see here is a widely circulated illustration put together by the Sons of Liberty of the events of March 5th, 1770. It was used to promote what they call the rightness of their cause, or the justification of a revolution. It depicts British soldiers firing on unarmed citizens, which actually did happen, not necessarily how it's illustrated here. And that became known as the Boston Massacre. Later portrayals would more prominently feature a person who was there as Crispus Attucks, an African American who was one of the first people to die in this encounter. 8 British soldiers were tried for murder as a result of this confrontation. Now, we say this is a sensationalized version because it has to tell the story in one printing. The media, they'd never sensationalize anything, would they? Yes, they would. Speaking of oversimplifications within one photo, here is a presentation of the Declaration of Independence commemorated in a painting by John Trumbull in 1817. So this is well after the fact. It was commissioned to hang in the capital of Washington, D.C. It's one of the most recognized photos in the history, or paintings, I should say, in the history of our country. And it's actually a gross misrepresentation of what happened here. First of all, the capital was temporarily, or at least initially, set up in Philadelphia. You had people from all over the 13 colonies coming and going. And they were, it was July, it's hot. They wouldn't all pile in a room like this. They weren't all there at the same time. They were working back and forth, and certainly working as a Continental Congress to develop the Declaration of Independence, or at least a varied form of the Continental Congress, not really the Continental Congress yet. And their Declaration of Independence was signed on the go. People were coming and going. They never were in one room, but again, as a painting going to capture that, they put them all in one room. So, what you have to understand is there were 13 different colonies, representatives from each colony, and 13 different ways they wanted to see a new country birth and how they wanted it to work. This contemporary depiction of a Continental Army veteran, Daniel Shays on the left and Job Shattuck on the right, they led an uprising of Massachusetts farmers from 1786 to 1787. So we had people who were simple farmers, and they went to war. They were a part of the revolution. They stepped up. They, being Massachusetts, called for a stronger national government, whereas Virginia and a lot of southern colonies weren't so keen on trading what they saw dictator in King George for several dictators in the form of a colonized national government. But something's to be said about having a strong national presence when it comes to a king trying to reclaim a bunch of colonies. You're stronger together. Now, when I said that every colony had their own plan, they really did. And in the spirit of compromise, and conversation, which is the whole point of political science. It's about conversation, which usually leads to compromise. We had the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. Then the Virginia plan called for a two-house legislature. Representation of both houses will be based on population. Now, there was some disagreement on who counted in population, which we'll talk about here in a second on the next slide. A state's representatives in one house will be elected by the state's voters. Okay, so based on population, you have a certain number of slots, and your state's voters, your colony's voters, would send those representatives up there. That sounds a little bit familiar to at least the House of Representatives of what we have today. These representatives would then appoint representatives to a second house from among candidates chosen by the state's legislature. So the state's legislature put forth some candidates, and then the folks up in the national government would pick which ones are representative. That doesn't sound that familiar to the modern day system. The New Jersey plan favored a one-house Congress in which each state was equally represented. That sounds a little bit about the Senate, but they didn't get the part about the one-house Congress. We have a two-house Congress. So you're starting to see some compromise coming together. Now, let's set the tone for population, though. Aspects of the Declaration of Independence said that all men were created equal, but not everyone agreed as to who was a man. First of all, males were considered man, so women didn't have a voice. And second of all, roughly half thought of slaves as people, and the other half thought of slaves as property. Now that said, while the South typically saw them as property because they were a key cog in agricultural production, there was no mechanization, so you need a large labor force, and quite frankly, the costs were kept low when you had slaves. You had a labor force that you could literally work to death. Yet, if you're a plantation owner in South Carolina, and there's you and maybe your son that could vote, but at this point you had to be a property owner. So let's just say it's you, and then you had 300 slaves. You didn't want someone in the North telling you, you know what, we have all these industrial workers. We have 300 people that want to vote. Well, guess what? It suddenly behooved the South to see slaves as individuals who should give that one voter, who was a property owner, the right to have the say of 301 people. Whereas in the North, they said, you know what, you're saying slaves are property, they shouldn't count in terms of representation. So this speaks to a combination of the New Jersey and Virginia plans when we're looking at representation based on population. The South, under the Northern plan, would have had a much lower population if you didn't count the slaves. So the South all of a sudden wanted to count the slaves towards how many votes they should get, what kind of representation they should get in a proposed Congress. Whereas the North said, well, no, you're saying they're property. We have more of a population, New York, New Jersey, etc., except Boston. You should get 0 votes. So what we see here is, hey, Virginia and below is saying, hey, 5 slaves should be 5 votes. 5 citizens should be 5 votes. So we should get more representation. New Jersey plan, which is an extension of our previous slide, 5 citizens, 5 votes. That's fine. 5 slaves, you're saying, are property, 0 votes. So what did they do? They had a conversation. They had a compromise. 5 citizens, 5 votes. They both agreed on that. 5 slaves will get you 3 votes. So if you're a larger plantation owner with a larger amount of slaves, you gave your state more of a voice. Now, again, this isn't the class to be debating the virtues of slavery or the complete lack of virtues of slavery. I'm just trying to give you context of how the system was developed. What we ended up with were 3 branches of government. They are the executive, the judicial, and the legislative. So, to prevent the national government or any group within it from becoming too powerful, the Constitution wisely divided the government into 3 branches with different powers. No one branch could function without the cooperation of the others. And each one serves as a check on the other. So each branch could restrict the powers of the others. Let's start with the executive. Probably the most well-known is the president is the commander-in-chief of the nation's armed forces. The president is responsible for conducting foreign affairs, dealing with other dignitaries. The president appoints federal judges, ambassadors, and the heads of executive departments, bureaucracy, and agencies. The president may grant pardons to those who have broken federal laws. So if something overstretches in the judicial, the president has the ability to put a check on it. The president has the president has power to veto legislation passed by the Congress. So the president can forgive people in the judicial, and the president can veto things coming out of the legislature. So you have their powers, and they have checks on these other two. Let's move to the judicial. It's topped off by the Supreme Court, which hears cases involving federal law and is a nation's final court of appeal. The Supreme Court has the power to declare laws and actions by the executive branch unconstitutional. So they can put a check from the judicial back on the executive. So the executive has checks on these two, judicial can check the executive, and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court presides over impeachment trials, which handle in the legislative, so they have a check over here, and they can determine certain policy to be unconstitutional. So the judicial checks on this legislative and on this executive. What about the legislative? We're talking about Congress here. It has the pass the power legislation. It may declare war. The Senate has the power to ratify treaties signed by the president. Keep in mind the Senate, largely the idea of the New Jersey plan. The Senate must also give its consent to the president's appointment of federal judges, ambassadors, and heads of executive departments. So the president can appoint people to those, but they must be confirmed in the Senate. Congress may impeach the president and remove him or her from office. So legislators have to check on the executives in terms of their appointees and impeachment. Congress may establish the number of Supreme Court justices and regulate the court's jurisdiction. So if the judicial started doing some stuff that wasn't great to either the executive or the legislative branches, Congress can double back and check them. So each one of them has checks on the others, and basically the whole system in terms of policy is designed to have checks and balances. So if one particular branch gets out of line, the other two can bring them back to earth. And if you remembered, we talked about an elected, evenly balanced Senate, New Jersey plan. We also talked about the Virginia plan wanting things based on population, which made the slavery issue a question. We ended up in a 3/5 compromise, which we talked about last slide. We had the House of Representatives, which you have more representatives based on your population. To this day, that is true. So the Virginia plan ended up largely leading to the U.S. House of Representatives. And the New Jersey plan ended up largely being the Senate. And then we divided those powers between three branches, the executive, judicial, and legislative branches of government. So what about states' rights? We ended up with a pretty powerful federal government. States' rights have varied over time. It's an interesting experiment in government in that states can pass interstate legislation such as laws on commerce, drug use, and marriage. But judicial rulings at a federal level may supersede such legislation. So I'm going to mispronounce this, Obergefell versus Hodges in 2015, which is a Supreme Court case that established marriage equality. You can see that some states have legalized marijuana. They even make it hand over fist in terms of taxation and sales. The state itself is the one selling the marijuana in some places like Colorado. But federal law still says dealing marijuana is a federal offense and punishable by imprisonment. So it's an interesting tightrope that we walk with states making certain rules and the federal government saying, that's too far. Or states making certain rules and the federal government being pretty tolerant of it and even reinforcing when we look at marriage equality. It's an interesting dynamic. It's the democracy system that we have, our republic, is quite the social experiment. Now, how do we get there? Well, you're also you need to read these. We're going to work our way towards the propaganda, the information that was put out to help people to support the proposed government in the Constitution. So we had satire. The Massachusetts Sentinel cartoon encourages states voters to join Georgia and neighboring Connecticut in ratifying the Constitution. So all these little colonies coming together as the United States of America, not the colonies anymore, United States of America, there was a lot of, the Twitter of the day was the newspaper. The Twitter of the day were the papers that were handed out. So this came out, this was what, January 1788. This is coming out on February 6, 1788. Massachusetts became the sixth member of the newly formed Federal Union. So we formed a union. So what was the timeline of people ratifying the Constitution? First out, Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maryland, South Carolina in on the game, New Hampshire, Virginia, New York, North Carolina, Rhode Island. This timeline shows the order in which the states ratified the new Constitution. Small states that would benefit from protection of a larger union ratified the Constitution almost immediately. If you're Delaware and you're Connecticut, you're like, heck yeah, man, I need some bigger brothers to help me out. I'm small. Larger, more populous states like Virginia and New York took longer. They wanted to make sure they got their pound of flesh. Quite frankly, they had more people so they could defend themselves longer. The last state, ironically, was one of the smallest one to ratify was Rhode Island, a state that had always proven reluctant to act alongside of each other. So Rhode Island was always kind of an interesting case. It's one of the smallest, yet seemed to be one of the more resistant when it came to ratifying, which was kind of counterintuitive when you see people like Delaware and Connecticut jump on it pretty quickly, and then larger states say, let's work out some things to our advantage. Rhode Island was just going to Rhode Island. It was just going to be its thing. One of the key aspects of getting the Constitution ratified, a big player was New York. It was one of the biggest colonies. It was also at the time of the pre-revolution and during the revolution, it was a largely Tory area, meaning they supported the king and they supported not leaving England. However, after the war from 1787 to 1788, the Federalist Papers were published in papers in New York. Now, the Federalist Papers were quite numerous, but they were written all by three people: Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. They did a series of essays intended to convince Americans, especially New Yorkers, to support the new Constitution. These essays, which originally appeared in newspapers, were collected and published together under the title The Federalist in 1788. They are now known as the Federalist Papers. If you've had an opportunity to see the musical Hamilton, my family and I have after Disney Plus added it, it goes a lot into Alexander Hamilton writing the Federalist Papers. Alexander Hamilton was a prolific writer. He wrote the bulk of the Federalist Papers. Some were also written by James Madison, who's largely considered to be the architect of the Constitution, and John Jay as well. But Alexander Hamilton was a straight boss when it comes to writing Federalist Papers. James Madison played a vital role in the formation of the Constitution. He was an important participant in the Constitution Convention and authored many of the Federalist Papers. Despite that fact, he did not believe that the Bill of Rights was necessary, which is a little bit puzzling. He wrote one in order to allay the fears that those who believed the Federalist government was going to be too powerful. James Madison was from Virginia. His counterpart was Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was one of the people who really was nervous about a overbearing national government because they were just leaving an overbearing king. So he served as Thomas Jefferson's vice president and was elected president himself in 1808. Alexander Hamilton, on the right here, was one of the greatest political minds in the early United States. He authored the majority of the Federalist Papers and served as the Secretary of the Treasury in George Washington's administration. As you know, he was tragically lost in a duel. Most people throw their shots, and his opponent did not. And again, if you have access to Disney Plus, selfishly, I encourage you to watch that. It gives a good story about Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr, who shot him and was subsequently ostracized from the country. Alexander Hamilton was George Washington's right-hand man and absolutely would have become a president had he not had an untimely death. Alexander Hamilton's also an interesting study in that he grew up fatherless in the Caribbean and wrote a poem, or an essay, I think it was a poem, about a hurricane that hit the island he was on. And the islanders read it and said, this is fantastic. This kid has real potential. We should send him to school. So the islanders got together. These were both English settlers, slaves, merchant traders, got together. He was working at a dock as like a clerk, and he wrote this poem. they got together and put together basically a GoFundMe for old Alex Hamilton here. And they sent him to school in New York City, where he received his education, and caught the eye of a young general named George Washington. And when the Revolution was birthed, Alexander Hamilton was right there. And he really became Washington's right-hand man. He is an interesting story. I feel like the stories of a underdog, a fatherless boy from the Caribbean that should not have made it, who made it big time. If you ever get a chance and you want to read a great book about Alexander Hamilton, Ron Chernow's Alexander Hamilton is incredible. It's a great read. I love an underdog, and he was definitely one of those. So what does this all lead to? Well, we have a progression not only through the Constitution, but also a perfection of the Republic. So you had a ratification of the Constitution 1787. Then you have you have the 1870s. You have African American males who were freed slaves could then vote. 60 years later, 60 years later, in 1920, women earned the right to vote. Think about that. Women, white women, black women, whatever. Okay? Women couldn't vote until the 1920s. A lot of people forget that. That wasn't that long ago. Okay? Women who were advocating for the right to vote, it's called women's suffrage, would encourage Ohio men to support votes for women. Before the 19th Amendment was added to the Constitution, 19th Amendment, 1920, only a few western states such as Wyoming gave women the right to vote. So it was really a states' rights issue, states determined. So obviously they attracted a largely female audience for earning the right to vote. But just an interesting, again, the interlacing between history and how the Declaration of Independence and the Federalist Papers led to the Constitution within the construct of history and how it evolved over time. It's truly fascinating. And one thing you might not realize is you're living history right now. We're coming off a decade where we voted in our first black president. We have ever-changing challenges with a pandemic. The question of overreach of national government into states' rights by mandating shutdowns. They're making recommendations, and the different states are shutting down more than others. And you wonder what the long-term, costs are going to be for that. Because if your governor is pretty heavy-handed in a shutdown, you can be seen either as a hero to some who have prevented, say, more spread of the coronavirus, or you can be seen as a tyrant. It's going to be a fascinating decade ahead, just not only to see the political candidates to come out, what changes happen on national, state, and local level. It's also going to be interesting to see if there's any backlash on governors who were too lenient or governors who were too stringent, and how people choose to have their voice heard. I hope you're a person. I'm never going to tell you who to vote for, and I'm never going to tell you that you're wrong or you're right. But I will tell you your voice needs to be heard. Now that said, we're not going to talk about your candidate in this class. We're not going to talk about my candidate in this class. We're just going to talk about the candidates within the constructs of the system. But to understand the system, you've got to know its history. You've got to know its timeline. You've got to know how it came about that led us to this. And then you've got to participate in this process. And you got to know this picture's complete BS, even though it looks pretty cool. And this guy's a quiz answer, just saying. American National Government, Chapter 2, the Constitution and its Origins. That was fun. Come back for the next lecture.